right. I want to talk about maybe a dicey topic a little bit. And I'm sure I've talked to many of you on this in sessions. Rejection. So it does happen to us often, and sometimes it's perceived, and sometimes it is actually happening and it is real. And either way, I think that for us, we just in those moments we experience the worst. We just feel like it's the end of the road, that there's nothing after that. We can't recover. We It connects right down to our identity, who we are, our value, what we think of ourselves, whether we're lovable, we're valuable, we're acceptable. And it might feel like, the world is just caving in. Parts of us get so deeply hurt and so triggered when we perceive that rejection, or when it's actually happening and we see it happening. And then the question that immediately comes after that is, what's wrong with me, right? um, and it makes it really hard, because it's actually really hard to come up with an answer to a question like that, because chances are there isn't anything wrong with you, but the perception itself of yourself and of the situation is shaping what you're experiencing emotionally in that moment. So it can get really hard to really know where to go from here. And so for some of us, we have higher sensitivity towards rejection than others, and that can be related to many different things. There are sometimes, and I know, like, I think most of you know that I am not big into labels and, you know, disorders and calling things like that, but just for the sake of understanding how the world functions and sees these pieces, putting a name to it sometimes can be helpful. So, for someone that has features of ADHD, for example, we have a higher tendency to really feel, you know, sensitive towards rejection or perceived rejection. And so, and in those cases, there's even a name for it: rejection sensitive dysphoria. And even if a person doesn't have, you know, ADHD, sometimes a background in different types of trauma can also leave us feeling really intense around rejection, what the other person is thinking of me. And what rejection sensitive dysphoria actually means, it's that this intense emotional pain that we experience that is connected to criticism and connected to rejection. And this includes both the real, like I said, the real rejection, and what we perceive as rejection. Now, many of us have been told that we are maybe too sensitive, or too dramatic. And that can bring a lot of shame. And so there's nothing really technically to be ashamed of here. Um, we're not really doing anything wrong. These are just emotions, and emotions give us information. And information help us shape our thoughts, and they help us shape our behavior. So if I can look at that emotional content as information, I will handle it a lot different than just a given that something's wrong with me and that's why the person is rejecting me. So for some of us, when there is sensitivity to perceived rejection or rejection itself, the brain can be a little wired a little differently, right? Which means that we have to work a bit harder to regulate our feelings, to regulate the emotional content that we're experiencing. Um, and for some of us, if I'm gonna just give you like research based information here, for some of us, this can even be genetic, right? That we're predisposed to it to a certain degree. But that doesn't mean that we can't change and we can't cope and we can't regulate. It just means that for some of us, we have to work a little bit harder. And so, as a therapist, as your therapist, I'm encouraging you to put more work when this is something that you're experiencing. It is one of your own personal challenges. That rejection is tough for me. It's a harder emotion to deal with. I perceive other people's behaviors as rejection more easily, maybe than someone else. Some people call it I take it personally. It is okay that that's happening. It's just what I do after that with the information that I'm gleaning that can create change. So, some common behaviors that are related to that sensitivity to rejection is that intense emotional reaction to criticism or rejection, again, whether real or perceived. And and what it leads us to is avoiding situations where we fear that we're going to be criticized or rejected. And that means maybe less social interaction. Maybe, you have an opportunity for a job interview and decide not to take it, or you don't apply for a job at all, or you stay at home, you isolate in your own room, and you don't connect with your family as often. Maybe you like a girl or a boy and you decide not to ask them out because of fear of rejection. So there's so much that could result from that fear of rejection that can almost derail our lives if we don't take that as information and work with it. We just take it as a given and that I am rejectable and I just kind of survive or live that way. And so that also can lead us to have low self esteem, devaluing our own selves, which again can lead us to negative self talk. And when there is that unpleasant conversation that we have with ourselves, it just reinforces that cycle, right? And so I don't know if you've noticed so far from what I'm saying that there are so many pieces to this that are actually in my hands that I can do something about. What I say to myself, how I perceive the behavior of others as rejection or not. If I perceive it as rejection, what I do with that once I receive it, or once my system for accuracy receives it as rejection, what am I doing with that? Am I taking it as information and doing something good to inform my behavior, or am I just giving into it and saying, yeah, I'm not good enough, I'm not valuable enough, of course they would reject me, and then reinforce the cycle. Rumination is this fancy word that we use to talk about obsessive, repetitive, unhelpful thoughts. Okay, that is really common when we have a sense of rejection within us. So that is basically me taking the words, beating myself up, saying I'm not good enough, and I keep going through the cycle over and over and over and over again. The way I view it, I don't think that cycles happen like this. It's like the same thing repeating like that. It actually happens like that, where you're spiraling down. The more conversation around it I have with myself that is negative conversation, the worse the situation gets in my own eyes and my view of it. So it does get so augmented inside of me. And it only makes sense that my external reaction is an explosion, or I have an internal reaction of implosion, which is explosion just internally. It feels just as bad. And with all of that, it puts me in a place of like halt. I can't move because rejection defines me. What this person has said about me defines me. And it makes it very hard for me to move forward, to make changes, to move from it, especially that I'm reinforcing it with my thought life. And I think a lot of the times we underestimate what we are saying to ourselves, and we underestimate what our thought life actually is doing, what thoughts are happening there. Often I'll ask myself and I'll ask clients, well, what were you thinking in that moment? Unaware, right? Don't even know what I was thinking. I just know what I felt. I felt awful. I felt, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, feeling really awful about it. And I wonder, I mean, if you can get curious with me, I wonder what thoughts were connected to the emotional content that I had and the dysregulation that I experienced. And I even wonder if I am to sit with that thought for a second and ask it, are you helpful? And if the thought is not helpful, we don't ask the question, is it true or is it not true? what the person said about me true or not true? That's irrelevant and unhelpful, because it's not going to move me anywhere, and it gives the other person a lot more control. But if I ask the question myself, is that thought that I had that is connected to how awful I feel, is that thought helpful? Most of the time, the answer is no. And if it's unhelpful, then the next question I ask myself, well, what can I do? What is a helpful thought, right? How can I look at this in a way that can be helpful to me, that can be helpful to my system? Then, if I do that, I am taking power back. So I want you to sit with that for a little bit and ask yourself, what has been happening recently that may have been making me see things as rejection, or I've perceived something in particular as rejection? What was it that led me there, or got me to these places? And as you answer that question for yourself, ask yourself, what thoughts were there, and how did these thoughts contribute? Were they helpful? Were they not? And if they weren't helpful, what other thoughts can I bring in here that can be helpful? But what I will discourage you from doing is, if a thought comes that says, "You're, I'm not good enough. I'm just not good enough for my, partner," right? Um, it's not necessarily a very helpful comeback to say, "Yes, I am good enough," because I'm not going to be convinced of that, right? And so you want to kind of take steps. As long as these steps are going in the right direction, it's helpful. So I could say to myself something like, well, I didn't feel that I was good enough in that moment after I heard my partner say this and this. Okay? I'm being very real with myself, not lying to myself. I'm not trying to convince myself of something. That's what I experienced. And then after that, I can say, I really did my best in that moment. And what I felt is that it was met with that rejection. I'm going to keep working on myself so that I can improve in this area. And the feeling I experienced was rough, but I really did do my best in that moment. So that's just an example of how I can move that thought process from, that place of, I'm never going to be good enough. They'll never accept me for who I am. I never do anything good. This is awful. This is never going to get any better. I should have never been with this person. I'm not good for them. They're better off without me, right? That cycle that goes. If I move it to something else, you're going to notice that your emotional content starts changing, because you're taking your power back and you're empowering yourself to change the way that you look at that rejection that you experienced and put it in a different frame so that you are able to make changes, right? So just contemplate this, think about it, and see where it takes you.